Buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into a topic that could seriously impact all of us, the future of the Chinese economy.
It's a bit of a wild ride, really. We're not just talking about numbers and forecasts here. It gets deep global power shifts, the future of manufacturing, even what Chinese society might look like.
Yeah, to really unpack all of this, we're looking at the work of geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan. We've got one of his recent YouTube videos, plus a summary of a podcast episode where he really goes all in on this topic.
And Zeihan, well, he's known for, let's say, strong opinions. He makes some bold claims about where this is all headed. So we're here to break down those arguments, see if the evidence backs them up, and most importantly, what it could mean for you.
Exactly, because this isn't some theoretical economics lecture. This is real-world stuff, prices of goods, global stability, the things that actually touch our lives.
Absolutely. Now, a big part of Zeihan's argument centers around what he calls the U.S.-led order. Basically, it's the global system of trade and security that's been around since World War II. And he says that China's economic miracle, all that crazy growth, is built almost entirely on this U.S. system.
Wait, so even though we often think of China and the U.S. as, like, economic rivals, Zihan's saying China's actually dependent on us. I'm not sure I follow that.
It does seem counterintuitive, right? But his point is China's relied heavily on things this U.S.-led order provides. Things like access to cheap energy, safe shipping routes, thanks to the U.S. Navy, and, of course, a massive U.S. consumer market to buy all the stuff they make.
Okay, I get that part of it, but China's got a ton of its own resources, a huge population, and their government seems pretty set on doing things their own way. Are they really that reliant on us?
That's the big question. And to be fair, they have been working for years to lessen that reliance, diversifying their economy, building up their military, finding other energy sources. But Zion thinks it won't be enough because of some major challenges coming their way.
Challenges like?
Well, he lays out these 3 Ds: deindustrialization, urbanization, and potentially a complete economic collapse. He paints a pretty bleak picture. China loses its manufacturing power, people flee the megacities, living standards plummet.
I've heard talk of China's economy slowing down, but deindustrialization, urbanization, those feel like some intense words. Why does he think it could get that bad?
He points to a few things: rising labor costs in China, other manufacturing hubs popping up, and potentially less global demand if the U.S. brings more manufacturing back home. He thinks all of this could, well, hollow out China's industrial core.
Okay, so I see the deindustrialization part, but then there's that even scarier word, decivilization. Is he really suggesting that Chinese society could completely fall apart? That just seems extreme.
He's definitely using some strong language.
Yep.
What he's getting at is this: if China's economy stalls out hard, it could lead to massive social unrest, the government losing control, maybe even a return to regionalism and conflict within China itself.
He uses those historical parallels, right? China going back and forth between strong central power and then fragmenting.
Exactly. He argues that many parts of China, especially those dependent on complex water systems for agriculture, or those heavily reliant on imported resources, they become super vulnerable if the central government weakens and can't provide the same level of support.
Wow. Okay, so even if we don't see a total decivilization, it sounds like there's a real potential for instability, and we haven't even touched what many see as China's biggest ticking time bomb, the population problem.
Ah, yes, the demographics. And this is where things get even more interesting. Zeihan believes that China's population situation is far, far worse than official numbers suggest. He claims there's been a major overcount of the population, that the birth rate is plummeting even faster than people realize, and the consumer base is shrinking rapidly.
And what does that demographic shift mean, according to Zeihan?
He thinks it could be a major brake on their economic growth going forward. A shrinking, aging population equals fewer workers, fewer consumers, and potentially, less innovation and dynamism in the economy.
So if things are looking this potentially rough, what's the Chinese government doing about it? I mean, they have to see these issues coming, right?
Well, this is where Zeihan gets really critical. He's highly skeptical of the government's ability to handle these challenges. He argues that policymaking has become super ineffective, mainly because President Xi Jinping has been consolidating power and purging officials who might challenge him. So he's saying competence has been sacrificed for loyalty, leading to bad decisions and distorted information.
He doesn't sugarcoat it, does he? I remember that phrase he used, monkeys on a keyboard, to describe the Chinese leadership. But is that too pessimistic? I mean, surely China isn't just sitting around while the economy melts down, right?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are other analysts who believe the Chinese government is more adaptable, more resilient than Zeihan gives them credit for. They point to China's history of economic reform, their ability to mobilize resources quickly, and their focus on cutting-edge technology and infrastructure.
So it sounds like a genuine debate. Is China headed for a crash landing, or can they adapt and find a new path to success?
Exactly. And even if they don't completely collapse, any significant slowdown in their growth would have huge ripple effects globally. Think supply chain disruptions, shifts in global power, a whole lot of uncertainty for everyone.
Yeah, it really hits home how interconnected everything is. China's economy isn't just some faraway problem, it affects us all.
Right. And one of Zeihan's big worries is the availability of key resources and manufactured goods if China's output drops. He's particularly concerned about things like rare earth minerals, which are crucial for high-tech products. He even suggests the U.S. might actually be in a decent spot to benefit from this.
You mean because we could ramp up our own manufacturing and rely less on China? I can see that happening, but wouldn't rebuilding those supply chains take forever?
Absolutely, it would be gradual, and there'd be bumps in the road, no doubt. But Zeihan says the U.S. has some advantages that can make it smoother than you'd think.
Like what? We've been hearing for years that U.S. manufacturing is dead.
Well, Zeihan highlights a few things. First, our abundant natural resources, especially energy. He argues that cheap, plentiful energy is essential for competitive manufacturing.
Okay, I can see that being a big plus, especially with all the renewable energy growth we've got going on. But what about labor costs? Wages here are way higher than in China. Isn't that a huge problem?
True, wages are higher here, but Zeihan thinks automation and technology are leveling the playing field. He argues that the U.S. can compete on quality, innovation, and efficiency, even if we can't match China on sheer labor cost.
So it's kind of a bet on American ingenuity, on our ability to use technology to stay ahead.
In a way, yes.
Yeah,
But it's also a bet on the U.S. economy being able to adapt to a changing world.
that makes sense. But let's zoom out a bit. What about the rest of the world? If China's economic influence shrinks, who else wins or loses?
That's a tough one. Depends on a lot of factors. But potential winners could be countries with diverse economies, strong manufacturing of their own, and access to key resources.
So places like Europe, Japan, maybe some Southeast Asian countries that have been building up their manufacturing.
Exactly. Those are the folks who could benefit.
Mhm.
More investment, bigger share of global trade, chances to develop their own tech.
But it wouldn't be all sunshine and rainbows, right? Even those countries would probably face disruptions and uncertainty.
Oh, absolutely. Nobody escapes the effects of a major global economic shift. And then, of course, there are the potential losers.
Who are we talking about there?
The countries hit hardest would be the ones that are super dependent on China for trade, investment, or aid. A lot of developing nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have become deeply tied to China's economy in recent years.
So we could be looking at more poverty, social unrest, maybe even political instability in those regions.
It's a very real concern. And it's part of what makes Zeihan's predictions so unsettling. A big decline in China's power wouldn't just be their problem, it would have massive consequences for the whole world.
And it's not just economics, is it? He also brings up the possibility of geopolitical instability, even conflict, if China weakens.
Yeah, that's central to his argument. He suggests a weaker China, dealing with internal problems and a drop in global standing, could actually get more assertive, more aggressive with its foreign policy. He sees potential flashpoints in places like the South China Sea and Taiwan, where they've got those long-standing territorial claims.
So in this scenario, we'd be looking at a world with more uncertainty, higher risk of conflict, and the potential for violence to break out in different parts of the world.
That's the worst-case scenario, and it's important to remember it's not a certainty, but it's something we have to consider as we try to understand what the future holds for China's economy.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. And I'll admit, it's feeling a bit heavy, a bit doom and gloom. Is there any room for optimism here? Are there any silver linings to this whole thing?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore more deeply after a quick break. Stay tuned. All right, we're back and ready to keep digging into this whole China situation. We've been going through some pretty intense predictions from Peter Zeihan, who, well, he paints a pretty concerning picture of what might be ahead for China.
Yeah, we've touched on a lot. How China might be more reliant on the U.S.-led order than we think. Those demographic challenges they're facing, the risks of losing their manufacturing edge, and of course, that big question mark hanging over their financial system.
And we've also said that Zeihan's views aren't the only ones out there. Some analysts are more optimistic about China's ability to adapt.
Right. It's not a simple black and white situation. The future is always uncertain, and it's crucial to consider all sides of the story. So let's play devil's advocate for a minute. Let's say Zeihan's right and China's economy really takes a hit. What would that actually look like? How would it impact the world? And more specifically, how would it affect our lives?
Well, one of the most immediate and widespread impacts would likely be disruptions to global supply chains. We're so used to having access to tons of products at affordable prices, and that's largely because of China's role as, well, the world's factory, as they say.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that made in China label on just about everything. Electronics, clothes, toys, even car parts.
Exactly. And if China's production capacity really drops, we could see shortages of certain goods, prices going up across the board, and maybe even production coming to a halt for industries that rely on those Chinese-made parts.
So are we talking about like our smartphones and cars getting more expensive and harder to find?
It's a real possibility, and it's not just consumer goods we're talking about. Businesses that rely on Chinese suppliers would have to scramble to find alternatives, which takes time and drives costs up even more.
And this is where Zeihan's argument about the U.S. potentially benefiting comes in, right? He thinks American manufacturing could make a comeback as companies try to diversify their supply chains and move production away from China.
That's his theory, and it's not totally crazy. We've already seen a trend towards reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., and nearshoring, moving it to places like Mexico. A decline in China's dominance could definitely speed that up.
But wouldn't that take a long time? Building new factories, retraining workers, setting up entirely new supply chains? That's not something you do overnight.
You're absolutely right. It would be a gradual process, for sure, and there would definitely be challenges along the way. But Zeihan believes the U.S. has some key advantages that could make things a bit easier.
Like what? I mean, haven't we been hearing for decades that U.S. manufacturing is a thing of the past?
Well, he points to a few things. First, our natural resources. We have a lot of them, particularly energy. And he says cheap and plentiful energy is key to being competitive in manufacturing.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that's a big plus, especially with all the growth we've seen in renewable energy. But what about those labor costs? Wages here are way higher than in China. That's got to be a problem, right?
True, wages are higher in the U.S., but Zeihan believes automation and technological advances are changing the game. He argues that the U.S. can compete on quality, innovation, and efficiency, even if we can't match China on pure labor costs.
So it's kind of like we're betting on American ingenuity, on using technology to stay ahead.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But it's also about the U.S. economy being flexible and adapting to a changing world.
That makes sense. Okay, let's zoom out even further. What about the rest of the world? If China's economy shrinks, who else wins or loses in this scenario?
That's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer. It depends on a lot of things. But the potential winners would likely be countries with diverse economies, strong manufacturing sectors, and those that have access to key resources.
So places like Europe, Japan, maybe some Southeast Asian countries that have been building up their manufacturing sectors.
Exactly. Those countries could see more investment, a bigger share of global trade, and opportunities to develop their own technologies.
But it wouldn't be all roses, right? Even those countries would probably face some disruption and uncertainty.
Absolutely. No country is completely immune when a huge global economic shift like this happens. And then, of course, there are those who would likely lose out in this scenario.
And who are we talking about there?
The most vulnerable would be countries that depend heavily on China for things like trade, investment, or aid. We're talking about a lot of developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that become closely linked to China's economy.
So we're potentially talking about more poverty, more social unrest, maybe even political instability in those regions.
It's a real worry, and it's one of the things that makes these predictions so serious. If China's power declines, it wouldn't just be their problem. It would have huge consequences for everyone.
And it's not just economics, right? We've also got those geopolitical risks Zihan talks about. He thinks a weakened China could become more aggressive on the world stage.
Right, that's a big part of his argument. He suggests that a weaker China, dealing with problems at home and a drop in global standing, could get more assertive, more aggressive in their foreign policy. He sees potential flashpoints in places like the South China Sea and Taiwan, where they've got those long-standing territorial claims.
So basically, we'd be looking at a world with more uncertainty, a higher chance of conflict, even violence breaking out in different parts of the world.
That's the worst-case scenario, and it's not a foregone conclusion. But it's something we need to think about as we try to understand what the future holds for China and the world.
Okay, this has been pretty intense, I've got to admit. It's a bit doom and gloom. Is there any good news here? Any silver linings we can point to?
That's a great question. And it's one we'll explore more deeply in the last part of our deep dive. While there are certainly some serious risks and challenges associated with the decline in China's economic power, there are also potential opportunities for positive change.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of opportunities are we talking about here?
Welcome back to the deep dive, where we've been trying to make sense of China's economic future, and it's been, well,
A bit of a roller coaster, to say the least. We've covered a lot of ground with Peter Zeihan's predictions. China's dependence on the U.S.-led order, their population challenges, the risk of deindustrialization, and even a potential financial meltdown.
right. And we've also acknowledged that Zeihan's take isn't the only one. Some folks are more optimistic about China's ability to adapt and change course.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this. Amid all this uncertainty and potential upheaval, are there any reasons to be hopeful, any silver linings to this rather ominous cloud?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's definitely worth exploring. One potential upside to a shakeup of the global economic order is a renewed focus on sustainability and resilience.
I like the sound of that, but can you break that down a bit? What does sustainability and resilience actually look like in this context?
Well, imagine if China's grip on manufacturing loosens up. It could be a chance for other countries to develop those supply chains in a way that's more sustainable, more resilient. Instead of relying on one country for everything, we might see production spread out, more diversified.
So you're thinking more regional hubs, less reliance on shipping things halfway across the world, and hopefully less damage to the environment.
Exactly. And it could push companies to make products that last longer, that can be repaired, so we're not just churning through resources and creating waste. We might even see a comeback for local craftsmanship and manufacturing, which could revitalize communities and create more localized economies.
That's a fascinating point. So maybe a decline in Chinese manufacturing could actually push us towards a global economy that's more sustainable, more able to bounce back from shocks, and more focused on the long term.
It's a real possibility. There are no guarantees, of course, and the transition would definitely be messy and unpredictable. But it's something worth thinking about and working towards.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about the geopolitical risks we talked about? Zihan seemed to think a weakened China could become more aggressive globally, which is a pretty unsettling thought.
It's definitely a valid concern, and we shouldn't ignore it. But there's another side of that coin. A China struggling with internal problems, economic woes, a population squeeze, they might actually be less likely to pick fights on the world stage.
So a China focused inward, trying to solve its own issues, might actually be less of a threat internationally.
Potentially, yes. Their priorities might shift towards stability and economic security at home, rather than territorial expansion or military adventures abroad. Again, no guarantees, but it's a possibility to keep in mind.
It seems like the big takeaway here is that we need to think critically and make smart decisions. We need to be aware of both the risks and the opportunities and be ready to adapt to a world that's changing fast.
Couldn't agree more. There's no crystal ball.
Mhm.
But by having these discussions, looking at things from different angles and staying informed, we can handle the challenges and hopefully steer things in a better direction.
So, what can our listeners do, practically speaking, to navigate this uncertain future? How can we prepare on a personal level for these potential shifts?
Well, on a personal level, it's always a good idea to diversify your investments, stay informed about global trends, and maybe think about developing skills that will be valuable in a future where manufacturing and technology could become more localized.
So, things like learning new technologies, supporting local businesses, even getting involved in community efforts that are focused on sustainability and resilience.
Exactly. Those are all great examples. And more broadly, we need to support policies that promote those things. Sustainability, resilience, innovation. We need to invest in education and infrastructure. And we need to talk to other countries, work together to build a more stable and prosperous world for everyone.
It sounds like even with all the potential chaos and disruption, there's a real chance for positive change. It comes down to the choices we make, both individually and as a society.
Absolutely. We can choose to be reactive, fearful, get caught up in the worst case scenarios. Or we can be proactive, informed, and try to create a future that's more sustainable, more fair, more resilient. The future is in our hands.
Well said. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into China's economic future. We hope you found it informative, maybe even a bit thought-provoking.
And keep those conversations going. Read, listen to different perspectives, talk to your friends, family, colleagues. The more we understand and engage with these complex issues, the better equipped we'll be to face whatever the future holds.
Until next time, keep diving deep.